All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our spring lecture series. My name is Katie Worthing and I'm the Executive Director of the Yarmouth History Center. And we're really happy to be hosting this program today with Ron Romano and Craig Stinson. This is something that's been in the works for a little while, but it really builds on research that's been happening over the last several years. So it's really fun to kind of see it come to this point. Just a few points before I formally introduce our speakers. First off, we'd like to thank the Leon and Lisa Gorman for their support of Leon and Lisa Gorman Fund for their generous support of our lecture series. We also rely on our members and supporters to help us put up programs like this. So thank you very much for your support over the years. To make sure we have the best sound quality for today's program, please make sure you are on mute during the program. Our speakers will take questions after the talk, but if you have one that pops into your head during the program, you can put it into the chat box and I'll pose it to them at the end of the talk, or you can save it to the end and ask it then. So one program note, our May lecture will take place again on Zoom on Tuesday, May 18th. That's at 4 o'clock. Our speaker then is going to be Carl Patrick Burroughs, who's presenting a talk entitled John Brown Russwurm, 1799 to 1851, The Main Roots of a Black Icon. Patrick Burroughs is a retired humanities professor and university administrator who's published extensively on the history of the Black press and antebellum Black emigration to Liberia. So he'll be joining us in May to speak about John Brown Russwurm, who lived in Yarmouth at one point and became an abolitionist newspaper publisher and governor of Liberia. So drop me an email if you'd like to be added to the list for that talk. For today's speakers, as I said, we're really pleased to be welcoming two speakers. Ron Romano is a native of Portland, Maine. He serves as an officer on the board of the National Association for Gravestone Studies and as historian for Spirits Alive, the Friends Group for Portland's 350-year-old burying ground. Author of 3 cemetery and gravestone themed books and multiple papers, he is a frequent lecturer on these subjects and has guided countless tours and visitors through Maine's historic cemeteries. His tour program at Portland's Eastern Cemetery was named by Yankee Magazine as one of the 5 best cemetery tours in New England in 2018. And I know you'll see why that's the case once he starts the program. Our other speaker is Craig Stinson, who is a retired United Methodist minister who lives in Edmond, Oklahoma. He grew up in Texas and Oklahoma and holds a BA from Southern Methodist University, a Master of Theology from Perkins School of Theology at SMU, and a Doctor of Divinity from Oklahoma City University. He's married to Dr. Krista Jones, a dentist who recently retired from private practice. A few fun facts about Craig that I recently learned. He once won second prize in an official punt, pass, and kick contest. There were only 2 entrants in this category though. Craig is also a dinosaur hunter. While he lived in the Oklahoma Panhandle, he found a phytosaur in the Triassic Formation, which was 210 million years old. Krista and Craig also chased total solar eclipses around the planet, and they have managed to experience totality 10 times from places as nearby as Wyoming to as remote as Papua New Guinea, Zimbabwe, Turkey, Tahiti, Egypt, and Peru, which is amazing. What a cool hobby. Lately, he's developed an interest in meeting his dead relatives from various centuries and crafting narratives about their often surprising lives. Welcome to both of you. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ron first, and then we'll move over to Craig.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, with a thumbs up if you can see that, everybody. Is that okay? Yep, okay, great. So I'm happy to help kick this off. Thank you, Katie, for the fine introduction. Great to see Craig online as well. We're going to talk at first here about the monuments that are really the starting point of the program, and then we'll turn it over and Craig will tell you more about the families that those monuments represent. And I want to thank, you'll see these names in a later slide as well in the bottom right, besides Katie and Craig. Tamara, Linda, and Steve all help work on the repair of the monument that is the subject of the talk. So we'll see that momentarily. So let's get started. I want to actually start with a quote from Craig's great aunt, whose name was Eva May Cole. In the 1950s, she came to Maine doing some research on the family. And in her notebook, she wrote, an odd-shaped headstone was erected by James C. Hill in 1859. And indeed, it is an odd-shaped headstone, as you can see. Here's a picture of it. In the background, you can see, this is at Hillside Cemetery, Baptist Cemetery in Yarmouth. You can see in the background what a typical gravestone looks like for the period, but certainly this one looks what she called odd shaped. Certainly that's the case. It's one of a few dozen that we know about in Maine, and I'm going to show you a few examples here. I first I'm calling it a discovery. These certainly were around for 150 years or more, so it's not like I discovered them, but they haven't been studied. So we call them a discovery and a new monument type. This started in Cumberland, just one town south of Yarmouth. I was doing research for my first book, actually about stonecutter Bartlett Adams, searching all the local cemeteries for his gravestones. And in doing surveys throughout the region, I would keep my notes. And I had a note in the Cumberland Congregational Cemetery in Cumberland where I mentioned this one and said, it looks like a billboard. And it's because it was this large sort of signboard, as you can see, up on posts above ground. This one is interesting because I call it the Four Wives billboard. It's actually honoring or memorializing Reuben Sawyer, who died in 1848. And here's the succession of his 4 wives that he married, each younger than the predecessor, but he outlived them all. So their names are here on these panels on this one. This is a marble stone that's held above ground on these granite posts by the metal hooks, as you can see. In the same cemetery, there's another large marble, what I call a billboard monument. This one's also elevated off the ground with metal hooks, but it's a metal frame. I'll show you the back side in a minute. This one is kind of special because it's got this nice decoration in the top center, but you can see that it memorializes the patriarch of the family, his wife, his widow, and 3 of his children. Here's the back of that one. You can see the metal frame. That looks to be original to the monument, and you can see how it holds that large stone above ground. And then notice, of course, in the background, the more traditional gravestones that you find in colonial and post-colonial cemeteries in our area. The third one from the same cemetery is slate instead of marble. And this one you can see is also elevated above ground on granite posts with these metal hooks. And what this shows us is, notice the panels here in this one. This was created basically for these 2 children of the Blanchard family because they died within a very short time of each other, and they were memorialized on these 2 panels. A third child of theirs, an adult son, was memorialized on this other panel and later added. This is blank, and I believe that this was probably originally intended to be for the parents, but when they died many years later, they were buried at the same cemetery with their own markers. So this remained a blank panel on this particular stone. So what makes a billboard marker? It's basically airspace. So here's a typical design, as you can see, and as you've just seen, it's a large stone held above ground, usually on posts and held up by different means. The ones that I've found in Maine and beyond are up to 3 feet tall. This is the slab itself, is up to 3 feet tall, up to 7 feet long. Those marble and slate slabs are typically 1.5 to 2 inches thick. And these are heavy. I mean, with a dry weight of about 450 pounds to 500 pounds for the largest ones, that's an awful lot of weight that's being held up, above ground for 150 or 200 years. Stones that are common, the stone types, which are marble and slate, are porous and they will absorb water. So when it rains, these stones can gain another 15% of their dry weight, putting some of these at over 500 pounds. So the gravity, the pressure, downward pressure on the weight of these things often splays those 2 posts apart, and so many of them fail. And so here's a typical one with the panels that were created by the monument maker. Many of them put these rods between the posts to hold the 2 posts together to prevent them from splaying and then the monument failing. And those show up in different areas of those markers. So I spent about a year doing research on this particular monument type with help from folks from MOCA, the Maine Old Cemetery Association, and from AGS, the Association of Gravestone Studies, and other interested people who are interested in old grave markers. Ultimately, what we found was 38 markers in these orange boxes spread throughout the state. You can see down here, Yarmouth has 2, Cumberland has those 3. So the South Coast is well represented. And then in here, we have another cluster. And then up here, Livermore, Mount Vernon, Wilton. Wilton's the hot spot. It's a town that has 5 billboards in it. And then a little farther afield, once the book got published about these monuments, which I expected to happen, people contacted me and said they knew of another one. And so after publication last May, there was one known in Blanchard, Lovell, and Parsonsfield. So we're up to 41 for Maine. So when were these made? Well, they were made truly in the mid-century. I mean, the earliest one is 1830s, the latest one is 1880s, but from a variety of means, I've been able to date them. And the majority of them, as you can see, are in the 80s, 50s, and 60s. And after that, they just sort of fell from common use. It might have been because they were failing. You know, they just wouldn't last, and monument makers realized it wasn't the best idea to put this design together this way. And where did they come from? Well, on the left, you see a picture of what's called a grave rail from England. The grave rails were traditionally wooden. These are metal, and these have lasted from the mid-1800s. They're in fine shape, as you can see. What's different about the burial practices is that these grave rails run the length of the grave instead of at the head of the grave. So typically around here, you see a headstone at the head of the grave. The bodies are actually laid parallel to these, inscription on the side. There is evidence of grave rails in colonial New England that were wood and with stone pillars that have since failed because wood just doesn't last 300 years. But there's no reason to not think that the English settlers brought this basic design over with them and that it just evolved over time. So here's English version. On the right-hand side, you see a wooden grave board. So these are grave rails on the left, grave board on the right, but it's a similar look. This is a wooden one from the late 1700s in South Carolina. Given the climate, it's lasted pretty well. But you know, it shows you that this design has been around for a long time, but there was nothing around for a long, long time until the 1800s, and then they sort of came back, as you saw. So in Maine, we have 41, as I mentioned, but as a result of the book and talking about it and, you know, doing lectures about this monument style, we know now of 11 stones in Vermont, 2 in New Hampshire, 3 in Western Massachusetts. I've met personally all of those. I know you can't meet a stone, but you know what I mean. I've been to visit them all. I've seen all of these except one, and I typically measure them and document their health, the state that the stone is in, and then do family research to learn, you know, who these stones memorialize. So I've got a pretty good database now of all the ones in New England. Let's get back to Yarmouth, though. Here's the Hill Family Billboard that we're going to spend a little time talking about. Here it is in 2019. The note at the bottom shows you, the picture shows you that this one has a large crack between the second and third panel. And in fact, about 60% of the monuments have structural problems by virtue of the fact that they're so heavy. Again, and that downward pressure creates problems. This one you can see, as it was in 2019, quite dirty. There was 5 or 6 different types of lichen growth on this panel. This is a marble stone, but it had this break, a through and through break between the second and third panel. Someone had put this post on the bottom to help keep that propped up. So it really was in, you know, a precarious situation. I was going to clean this one. I didn't dare touch it. I didn't want to touch it because I was afraid any motion or pressure on it might topple it. So I stayed away from it. But in fact, it fell on its own in the spring of 2020. This is what I found when I came to the cemetery and was just checking up on it. It had, in fact, over the winter collapsed, and somebody just leaned this other piece up. So I got on the phone and talked to Linda Grant, and I talked to Katie and let them know. I think Linda was certainly aware of it at that point. But anyway, that's the way it looked in the spring of 2020. And so we formed a rescue team through the summer, and that consisted of myself as sort of like the, team leader, as it were, pulling these folks together. But Katie certainly was involved. Craig, as a member, direct descendant of the folks that are on this monument, was definitely involved. A friend of mine, Tamara, who is a preservationist, had contacted me, and she saw this picture and said she thought she could work on it. We engaged her to do that work. And of course, we had to coordinate through the town. So Steve Johnson was involved. And again, Linda was right in there as well. So we put a team together from afar and got work going. By the autumn, it was nearly done. As you can see, there's a piece down here that needed to be reattached on the post, but you can see that it was back together. Here's the repair that Tamara did. She put a nice channel on the bottom to hold that upright so that this won't fail again in the same way. And of course, she did a nice cleaning of the stone as well. And then by first snow, you can see it really is looking fine. I mean, it's hard to see the seam, the repair seam here. And the lettering and the words on the monument really sort of pop back out again as it should. So it's looking beautiful, thanks to the fine work of Tamara and the cooperation from everybody on the team. Here's some of the detail. The center panel, top center panel reads, erected by J.C. Hill, Esquire, 1859. Joseph Coffin Hill is the man who put this monument up in 1859. It's one of the few that is dated. Most of them are not. So this is great that we have a date on it. The monument memorializes his parents and 9 of his siblings. He was the last survivor, the last one standing in this family of that generation. So he put this up for everybody, that are surrounding him that had passed. You can see the left-hand side, the top reads brothers and sisters, and they are then listed here. And then on the middle panel, on the right, we have father and mother, and you can see that they are memorialized on that third panel. So here's the center panel before and after, and you can see again with all the different types of lichen that this was in pretty bad shape, plus the break in the panel. And again, today, how it looks much, much nicer. So it's back to where it should be. And the very cool thing about this monument, in addition to it being dated, which is rare, is that it was also signed in the lower right-hand side. And the signature on the lower right said Hunt and Jewett, Portland, Maine. Now, Hunt and Jewett is Richard Hunt and his son-in-law, James Jewett. Here's an advertisement from the newspaper in the mid-century. They were together as partners for about almost 30 years between the two of them, running a gravestone shop in downtown Portland on Congress Street. So here's a typical ad that they ran during the period. What I find really interesting is that these guys were making gravestones, but notice in the ad, they show a tilting one instead of a nice upright one, which is what you'd think they'd be advertising. They actually did some great work. They won a medal at the 1859 exhibition of the Maine Charitable Mechanic Association, a bronze medal for marble work, which is here on the right. And coincidentally, 1859 is the same year they constructed the Hill billboard for Joseph Coffin Hill. Now, we're lucky when you come visit the cemetery to see that for yourself. It's right inside the gate, so you can't miss it. But we're really lucky to have a second one at the same cemetery. And this is Joseph Coffin Hill's daughter, Mary. She's memorialized on the left-hand panel here. She was the wife of Cyrus Sargent, who was memorialized in the center panel. This one is beautiful. It's actually the largest billboard in the Maine collection. So you have to walk down to see it. So this one also dated, but you have to look for it. Notice the center panel here of Cyrus Sargent himself and these 2 urns that he put on either side of the Mason symbols. And if you look closely, one reads erected, the other 1853. So there's no question in my mind that Joseph Coffin Hill was inspired to put the Hill billboard up after seeing his daughter memorialized on the one that his son-in-law had erected 6 years earlier. Here's a picture of Cyrus Sargent on the right-hand side. He's quite a character. Some of you from Yarmouth probably know his story, but really an interesting man who had ties to the South, and he was actually arrested for being a potential spy during the Civil War and had quite an ordeal with that. All of that's covered in the book if you're interested in learning more about him. Here's detail of that Sergeant billboard. You can see that Mary, Joseph Coffin Hill's daughter, died 1852 at age 26, but in very small letters, it says remains removed 1853. That's the date the stone was created. He had her remains disinterred from down south and brought up to Yarmouth for burial. And Alice, their daughter, died in New Orleans, 1850 at age 5. There's another daughter on this panel. Also at the bottom, Alice's remains removed 1850. So he had strong ties to, Yarmouth, even though he had property and a business down south, as he brought his child and wife home to Yarmouth for burial. So 2 great billboards at Hillside Cemetery to see. So celebrating the style, here's a few other pictures to show you what these look like. You can see the metal rod on this one. This is an interesting one, also with the shape of it. And then another form here on the bottom, they're held above ground by metal clamps that are buried below ground. There's a few of them that are taking this form. This one on the left, I took this picture because I get a kick out of the fact that here's a billboard monument and then there's a real billboard in the background, as you can see. So if you want to learn more about billboard monuments, there is a book. It's available in the gift shop of the Yarmouth History Center right now. There's autographed copies in there. In that book, you'll learn about all 38. Chapter 5 is dedicated to the Sargent family billboard. Chapter 6 to the Hill family billboard, which you're going to hear a little bit more about. And I'm going to turn it back to Katie and Craig. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Ron. That was really great. And for those of you who are local, if you want to see the stone, it's right by the road at Baptist Cemetery on Hillside Street, so it's hard to miss. Sargent's a little further back, but also easy to spot. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we will get started on the second part of the presentation, and I will turn it over to Craig.
All right. Well, thank you, Katie and Ron, for allowing me to share this venue with you. I admire you both. Ron has told the story about the family monument. I want to talk some about the people who are remembered there on the Hill billboard, to share about who they were as people and a little bit about what they got themselves into, and also about the joy of the search itself and the fun of finding new companions along the way. I'd like to talk about 3 generations of my Hill family who lived there in Yarmouth in the years from 1815 to 1864. Alexander Greenwood Hill and his father, James Coffin Hill, who commissioned the billboard, and his parents, James and Sally Pottle Hill, who are honored on the monument. Like many kids, I imagined digging up a buried treasure. I was always on the lookout for a Roman coin someone might have handed me in my change by mistake, or a Viking sword that I might find lying in the dirt. Did I mention that the ground I was searching was in Texas and the panhandle of Oklahoma? I eventually learned that every place hides a treasure. It's just that the nature of that treasure depends on the place's past. And as an adult, I did find a treasure while hunting in the Oklahoma Panhandle. As Katie said in my intro, there was not the second place plaque for punt, pass, and kick, but I did find a dinosaur, or at least a crocodilian relative of the dinosaurs that lived in the Triassic 210 million years ago and was called a phytosaur. Most of him or her now lives in the museum in Norman, Oklahoma. Here are some small pieces that I keep near me. Here's a complete phytosaur skull, not the one I found. This one's in a different museum in New Mexico. And here's a life-size model of a phytosaur skeleton coming at you. But I don't live in the Panhandle anymore, so I needed a new place to search for treasure. Like many of you, as I grew older, I got interested in searching for the treasures that are buried in my family's history. My mother's family in recent generation were all Texans. My great-great-grandfather was named Andrew Jackson Hill. He was a Texas Ranger. Here he is as a young man. He was born in Camden, Arkansas, 1840. He lost his father at a young age. He came to West Texas, died at a place called Merkel, 1913. Here he is in his middle years. Andrew Jackson Hill. 3 of my 4 great-great-grandfathers were named after Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson Stinson, Andrew Jackson Coggin, Andrew Jackson Hill, in case that gives you a clue about my 19th century roots. But I was always curious as to what came before that. Who was I before Andrew Jackson? Were we always Texans? Did I have a 3rd great-grandfather, and where did he live? About a century ago, a family member interviewed Andrew Jackson Hill's widow, Delilah, and asked her what she knew about her husband's father, my 3rd great-grandfather. This little piece of paper is what we have from that conversation. Grandpa Hill's father come from Maine, was a full-blooded Yankee, weighed 106 pounds. His name was Green Hill. He and his brother had a store in Cameron, Arkansas. He went to buy goods and was killed on a ship. Had several $1,000s in his belt, but it was stolen. His mother's maiden name was Townsend. Note along the right side, can you see it? It says, he was good looking. Isn't it fun what we think to ask and what we write down and what we can learn from a little slip of paper? My 3rd great-grandfather weighed 106 pounds. He was a full-blooded Yankee from Maine, not to mention he was good looking. And there was missing treasure that might still be found. In the 1950s, my great-aunt Eva Mae Cole from Abilene, Texas, wrote an 8-page family history. Here's what she had learned about my 3rd great-grandfather. About 1927, I questioned grandmother about her people, and she said that her grandfather Hill came from Maine to Camden, Arkansas, where he had a store. On his way to New Orleans to purchase merchandise for this store, his riverboat was in a race with another, and the one on which he was a passenger blew up, and when they found his body, his money belt was missing. So again, from a different source, my 3rd great-grandfather Hill had his origins in Maine, migrated to Arkansas. He was a merchant. There was a journey to New Orleans, a riverboat, a race, and explosion, and once again, mention of the missing treasure. Armed with these 2 bits of information and a lot of determination, Eva Mae went in search of Green Hill. She did a lot of legwork in the days when that was the only way to do it. And in 1954, in the DAR library in Washington, D.C., she first viewed a copy of Augustus Corliss' Old Times, North Yarmouth, Maine. After reading the several entries in that book, she became convinced that our Green Hill was the Greenwood Hill mentioned in Corliss, who migrated to Arkansas, and that the place in Maine where we needed to search was Yarmouth. So a year later, she and her husband made a trip from Abilene to Boston, where they rented a car and drove to Yarmouth in search of Alexander Greenwood Hill. They ended up there at the Baptist Cemetery, where Eva Mae wrote, as Ron had said, "I'm glad to say that this church and its cemetery are being preserved." To the left of the entrance, she found what she called the odd-shaped headstone, which was erected by James C. Hill in 1859. The one whose careful preservation we're celebrating today. She found the Billboard Monument, but she did not find what she'd come all that way to find: the burial of Alexander Greenwood Hill, or his father, James Coffin Hill, even though they lay just a few steps away in the cemetery. After a journey of several years and about 2,000 miles, she was standing less than 100 yards from what she came to find, but she missed it. I wonder how many times that's happened to all of us. And that's what I knew of our deeper family story for about 50 years. Frankly, it seemed pretty far-fetched to me. In 2009, I came across a description of a book written about Maine's coastal cemeteries by Karen Wentworth Battagnani. And I thought I'd just take a flyer and order it. The day it arrived, I opened to a brief chapter about the Yarmouth Baptist Cemetery, including this entry. There are others buried here who have left tales of dramatic deaths. In 1847, a 35-year-old man lost his life by an explosion of the steamboat Edna opposite the town of Columbia upon the Washilia. The book did not give the victim's name, but I knew this had to be it. A 35-year-old man, the explosion of a steamboat, now with the name Edna, a specific river, actually the Washita, which runs through, Camden, Arkansas, and the location of the tragedy off Columbia, which is in Caldwell Parish, Louisiana, on the way to New Orleans. I dropped the book and picked up the phone. Do you remember 2009? In those days, you still called information. I asked for the number of the Yarmouth Historical Society, if such a place existed. I imagine my call was like many that historical societies receive even today. Went something like this. There's a person buried in the Baptist cemetery there who was killed in a steamboat explosion in 1847. I'm trying to find out if his name was Alexander Greenwood Hill. Marilyn Hinckley, the director, was more than kind and helpful with her response. She looked up and photocopied several records for me, and a volunteer, Linda Haywood, went to the cemetery that December day to take photographs. That I mentioned was 2009. When the images arrived, here's what I saw. I guess all of us have experienced that overwhelming emotional reaction when you first set eyes on the answer to your quest. Somehow it manages to embody joy, wrapped in surprise, and I suppose salted with a certain amount of grief for this person you now know, but never knew. For a while, you can't think, you just feel. And it was true. After all, we weren't just Texans and Okies. At least somewhere in our blood, we were Mainers. Since that day, I've learned a lot about the Edna explosion, about why it happened. It was pretty brutal. An eyewitness said body parts flew everywhere, even back into the town. But it was not a race. Steamboat boilers were just extremely volatile in those days, especially when starting up their paddles after being in a landing. And I still have not learned what happened to Alexander's missing treasure. Although histories from Caldwell Parish, Louisiana say that in times of extremely low water, the wreckage of an old steamboat can occasionally be seen off the old landing. And a few decades ago, a couple of guys my age supposedly found a couple of $10 gold pieces when they were fooling around at the site unauthorized. One other curious thing about Alexander Greenwood Hill, and it matches with what Ron talked about with some of the Cyrus Sargent's family. Alexander Greenwood Hill died in Louisiana on June the 4th, 1847, and he was buried in Maine almost a year later, May 1848. How in the world did they transport his remains? The practice of embalming wasn't big yet, although it might have been used. Ice would have had to make it from Maine to Louisiana and back again, which is highly unlikely. I do think the Hill family probably knew Almond Dunbar Fisk, who invented the Fisk iron coffins, but his prototype was still a year or two in the future. But one method of transporting the deceased that was used in seafaring communities in those days and is occasionally mentioned in Yarmouth burial records is to bring the person home in spirits. That is, in a barrel of rum. I think that may be how they got my Alexander back to Maine. So the grave marker of Alexander Greenwood Hill names his parents, James C. and Mary B. Hill. They're buried right there beside their son, Alexander. And unfortunately, May Cole missed them too on her journey to Maine. She also missed seeing their house. Even though she had read about it in Corliss, she drove right by it on Main Street. The house where James C. Hill raised his family, including Alexander, is still there. It's still a home. One thing that might be of interest about James C. Hill is that he was the principal behind the so-called secession of Yarmouth from North Yarmouth. As those of you who live there probably know, the issue was how to deal with fire. At the time, North Yarmouth included the whole area around the coast and inland for several miles. They had a terrible old fire engine, vintage 1816, which was outdated and in poor repair, which was not effective or reliable against fires in the more crowded part of town by the coast. Then again, if you lived a few miles inland, where most of North Yarmouth's decision makers actually resided, no manner of fire engine was going to protect you, whether it was pulled by people or by horses, because it could not possibly reach you in time to save your burning property. Well, in 1848, James C. Hill led the charge for the town to purchase a new fire engine, or two if they could. The issue became so divisive that at one point there was not enough room in the meeting house to hold everybody who wanted to vote. So the leaders instructed the people, go out in the street and line up, ayes on one side, nays on the other. This apparently made for a great way to identify your adversary. And there seemed to have been quite a few fistfights that night. The ayes prevailed. There would be a new fire engine, but the rift between the people and cultures was too great, and the inlanders pulled out, petitioning to keep the true name of the community, North Yarmouth. The upstart group, who were seen as seceding, chose the name Yarmouth, which name was fair game now that Maine and Massachusetts had become two different states. Near the end of his life, James C. Hill of Yarmouth left a memorial to his parents and to his young brothers and sisters, most of whom had died in their teens and 20s. As Ron showed, you can see that after 150, 160 years, it had suffered quite a bit. Ron spoke about the incredible partnership that saved this monument and restored it to such beauty. I'd like to share my own word of appreciation for the partnership with the Yarmouth Historical Society, the skill and care of Tamara Conde's restoration, Ron Romano's willing partnership, Catherine Worthing's significant help and encouragement, Linda Grant from the Village Improvement Society, who is such an important part in helping to take care of the cemetery and the meeting house, and Stephen Johnson as town engineer, helping cement the relationships and make it all work together. For me, of course, part of the significance in restoring this monument is that it is a memorial to our family. I feel like I know them, even though until 12 years ago, I barely knew they existed, except as names on a piece of paper. And they've been dead, most of them, for almost 200 years. I've been especially curious and tender about all those Hills who died as young adults between 1817 and 1829, 3 of them in 1818. You can see that they died just a few months apart, and then a few years apart. Just this past year, I was finally able to learn what took them. All 6 died of consumption, tuberculosis. In those years, consumption was not an infectious disease, at least not as far as anyone knew. Because it can remain latent for so long, people didn't realize that when they were coughing, they were spewing into the air around them an unseen but deadly bacteria from a highly contagious disease. In those days, if someone died of consumption, it was supposed they were simply born with a weak constitution. But in reality, close and loving contact was actually spreading the disease. So with all these deaths of their children, of course, I began to wonder about their parents who had nurtured and supported them, only to watch 6 of them, one after the other, racked by a wicked cough, grow weak and translucent, to waste away and die. 2 of the young women, Sarah and Betsy, were engaged to be married when they died. What was it like for their parents, for James and Sarah Pottle Hill? James owned and operated a fulling mill and a carding mill on the mill pond there at the Fourth Falls, right there near the Historical Society building. He was a respected member of the community, as she was in the church. But all that was soon to change. In 1829, their next youngest daughter, Olive, died from this dreaded condition. In 1832, their youngest daughter, Mary, who had been near death for some time, made a miraculous recovery. Mr. and Mrs. Hill were relieved and elated. Their large home, which had been visited by so much death, was at last a place of promise and life. By the way, this house too is still a home. It's right across the railroad tracks from the Yarmouth History Center. Anyway, James and Sarah Hill were approached by a group who wanted to teach dancing to the young people of North Yarmouth. It was also a way for the young people to mix. Their youngest daughter, Mary, was 23. She had survived a visit from death that had taken all but one of her siblings. It was time for a little joy in the house. Unfortunately, that's not how their young pastor saw it. His name was David Shepley. Here's how the system worked for him. Reverend Shepley was not only the pastor of the church, he was also the equivalent of the chairperson of the board. He also became the recorder, the recording secretary. So essentially, he called the meetings, called them to order, invited the relevant reports, often giving them himself, and he called for the votes. Later, he recorded the minutes based on his recollection from the meeting. Often, he assigned himself to follow up on the actions the board had taken. How do we know all this? Because the church, and now the Yarmouth Historical Society, preserved all these old church minutes so we can examine them for ourselves today. Did I mention y'all save everything? Reverend Shepley did not think young people of North Yarmouth should be occupying their time with dancing, so he exhorted with the Hills. They said they had no idea this would be a problem and would try to get out of the contract. The dance company refused to cancel the contract. The pastor turned up the heat and threatened them with excommunication, which would cut them off socially and possibly economically. When the Hills defended themselves, Reverend Shepley said they had bad attitudes and were being recalcitrant. From reading the old church records, I knew that James and Sarah Hill were excommunicated in 1832. I knew their pastor felt they were being defiant in not seeing this as a sin and willfully disrespectful and not bowing to his authority. Because someone saved the records, I knew how the pastor felt. But I didn't know how my fifth great grandparents felt. They had lost so much. Were they bitter? Were they intentionally being recalcitrant? Were they baiting the pastor into a fight? How could you ever know their side of the story unless you had their own words? And how could you have their words? Someone would have to keep them. Someone would have to find them. Someone would have to see them as treasure. Someone would have to archive them, and someone would have to make them available to others who were searching. And here's where the Yarmouth Historical Society stepped in again. Executive Director Katie Worthing has been a real hero to me in all this searching while I'm 1,800 miles away from what I'm trying to learn. So I want to hand it now to Katie to share what I guess is the rest of this story, at least so far.
Thanks, Craig. This is without a doubt one of my very favorite moments and stories from my first 5 years as director, because of course we did find James Hill's own words, which is an entirely unlikely story, one where all of the puzzle pieces had to just be positioned so perfectly so that they could finally snap together into place and reveal some really fascinating stuff. So let's step back for a moment, back to January 2020. Seems like an age ago at this point, but really just over a year ago, when I was invited by the folks at Yarmouth First Baptist Church to pick up some church records for our collection. This is Yarmouth's second oldest congregation, dating back to the 1790s. And we have a substantial collection of church records of theirs in our archives, and we continually add to this collection. I brought along one of our trustees, Julie Benavides, who is pictured here. She also happens to be the chair of our collections committee. And when we visited that day, the pastor brought us up into the church attic and just said, you know, take anything you think would be useful for the archives, whatever would be appropriate. And you can see Julie in this photo peering into a very full trunk. And I remember looking into that trunk, sorting through the objects, trying to find fairly quickly what I thought would be useful for the archives. And down in the bottom corner, tucked underneath everything, was a little parcel of papers. And they're here, actually, if you can see my cursor, there they are, pictured in the lower left-hand corner of this photo. And I remember seeing them and thinking, that handwriting looks pretty old. I think I'll take that for the archives. So an entirely snap judgment. And we brought it back to the History Center. And that's where it's at. You know, this was January 2020, late January 2020. And in a few weeks, our world had changed sort of in historic ways with the arrival of the pandemic. The museum shut down during the early stages of the pandemic and gradually reopened through the summer. So it really wasn't until late summer that I had a chance to really take a look at those papers that I had grabbed because they looked old. And when I did, there was this amazing realization that they had been in the wrong church attic all along. So these weren't records of First Baptist Church, but rather Yarmouth's First Parish Congregational Church, which is the oldest in town, dating back to the 1730s. And as I started to unpack the letters and read them, the pieces started to fit together. I could see that they were mostly letters. I started to recognize names, Reverend David Shepley. I got a sense of the dates, 1830s, and a general sense that a lot of this correspondence had to do with excommunications from the church. And then, clear as day, the moment I unwrapped one letter, and there was James Hill's signature and his wonderful letter dated December 6th, 1832, which I have a photo of, here you go, relating his actions, his feelings about the dancing school, his thoughts about whether or not it was a sin. He really didn't think it was to do that. He wouldn't have done it again, he says. Did feel like it was an injury to the church and to Shepley, but he was pretty firm in his views. And it was just amazing to see this handwriting, that signature. You know, I can picture myself in the office unwrapping that letter. It gave me goosebumps almost immediately. And I know I let out a great whoop when I realized what it was, you know, in this empty museum, because we were still kind of partially closed at that point. And I immediately scanned it and sent it off to Craig. And just like Craig said, I sort of felt like I knew James Hill at this point. You know, he did live right next door to us at the History Center during his life. And I had been working with Craig on and off really for the last couple of years, really since 2017, on his family history questions, with a lot more progress in 2019 and early 2020. And so the names and places were really becoming familiar to me. And so I was primed to kind of be on the lookout for details on the Hill family. This is what happens with a lot of our research requests, that the letters would come out of the wrong church at just the right time to help with this quest was sort of a perfect moment of timing. And that collection yielded another letter too, this one from Mary Hill. She is the wife of James Hill's son, James Coffin Hill, he who put up the monument. And so here's her letter from 1835, her signature, her words, asking for her membership in the church to be dissolved. Reverend Shepley determines that that's not possible, and his notes on the back in pencil record sort of his plan and what ultimately happens regarding the vote on her excommunication. So these two little gems in a packet of letters in the wrong church's attic that came just at the right time to help a researcher with a family history quest. And it's really one of those moments that shows you that local history can be incredibly local, but it also can span quite a large geographical distance and reach people on different parts of the country. So a really fantastic find. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. If you've got questions or comments for Ron, for Craig, please feel free to type them into the chat box. Give me a wave. I can't see everyone on screen, so I'll do my best. Or just, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Linda Grant here. I just want to thank, what a wonderful program. So much fun. And it just shows you what you can find. And I also personally want to thank Ron for working so hard for our cemeteries, because sometimes we think about cemeteries and we go by and we just say, oh, isn't that too bad? Something's wrong, with this. And he helped us do some remarkable thing here, and so did Craig. Thank you very much.
I have a question that just popped up for me in chat from Holly Hurd, I think, who says, how do you think those first parish records came to be at First Baptist Church? And the answer there is, I have no idea how those letters that match what we have from First Parish Church, how they came to be in the wrong church's attic. My only theory, and this is totally just a theory, was that William Hutchinson Rowe, who kind of wrote the book on Yarmouth history in the 1930s, was involved with the Baptist Church. He was a Sunday school teacher there. So I sort of suspect maybe he had collected them and stashed them away in his belongings, Sunday school lectures and things that got stored in the church. That's my only guess. I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to that question. All right, here's another question from Abby, who says, were the Hills hurt financially by being excommunicated by their church? Were there other repercussions?
So actually, I don't think so too much. James Hill, after the excommunication, gave up the mills. He sold out, and he had just about had enough, I think, of sadness. But actually, this family was then some of the founding members of the Universalist church that started up right then. James C. Hill helped to fund the first pastor, and that's kind of examined in Corliss. But I think they did okay. There's quite a few people that, if you have the list of the early Universalists, then you'll see there were 20 or 30 of them before too long, and I think they kind of supported each other along the way.
Katie, what was the issue over which excommunication, or to which excommunication was the solution? I mean, was there somebody just wanted to withdraw from membership in the church and it required excommunication?
Well, I think in the letter, and Craig can talk a little bit more about this too, Mary Hill is sort of recognizing kind of the writing on the wall and saying, like, let's end this, and I'd like to just leave the church. But Reverend Shepley didn't allow it. So I'll let Craig kind of chime in on the more details there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. For James Hill, it was because they hosted the dance school and wouldn't get out of the contract, and Reverend Shepley thought they were being hard to deal with. But their daughter-in-law, Mary, 3 years later, she tries to withdraw from the church, and Reverend Shepley says, no, you can't quit us. We quit you. So he had a little technicality where we can't just release someone to the world. So we're not releasing you. And then they come back a month or two later and excommunicate her. So kind of a way of maintaining authority and control, I suppose.
Huh.
All right, a question from Julie for Ron. Why did the 1853 billboard stone seem to survive better than the 1859 one?
Yeah, well, the bad news is it's actually not in great shape. I have pictures I didn't put on the slide deck today of that 1853 stone that has 4 or 5 cracks on the lower edge, about 2 inches long, each one of them. And it really worries me that those stress fractures are occurring in that stone and that we may see a problem down the line with that one as well. It's a little bit thicker monument as well. That one is a little bit thicker than the Hill one, which had that big crack. The other thing that's interesting is the Hill one, which underwent all the repair, that had the big crack in it, that's right next to the gate. And that metal gate would, may have swung in, done some damage at some point. The gate is really hard to move today, but I would imagine at one point it probably swung pretty freely. Somebody could have just thrown that gate open and it whacked that monument. It's right next to the gate. So yeah, it has survived for the time being, but it's in some threatened state at this point. So we have to keep watching it.
And why do you think, Ron, that there are significantly more billboard monuments in Maine than in other New England states?
Well, I don't know for sure. Vermont has 11, which is a much higher percentage than New Hampshire has. And, the populations are probably pretty similar. New Hampshire's only got a couple of them. These monuments were made by different stone cutters who learned from each other, who were an itinerant group. And, it could just be that the luck of the draw for us is we had 5 or 6 different monument makers in Maine who learned the style and created them. And elsewhere, it wasn't the case. In Massachusetts, with the huge population in the eastern part of the state, no one's found a billboard yet. But out west, there's 3 of them in the Connecticut River Valley, and then up to Vermont. So it's, I think it's a regional thing based on who the monument makers were. And I'm just really glad we have 41. I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me they found another one. But it's been a little while since I've heard from anybody. So I think we might have the whole collection in Maine sort of buttoned up at this point.
I have a question. Would the actual terrain of Vermont and Maine be one of the factors why they have more billboards? Because I know, because I lived in Vermont for many years, it's hilly and rocky. So the terrain for putting a cemetery in some places was almost uninhabitable.
Yeah. I'm going to say, I don't know if the terrain matters, because these have been found in cemeteries that are on very steep hillsides, but also in very flat plains. And the depth that would be required to bury those posts to support that stone has to be pretty deep as a regular stone. So I'm not sure the terrain is a factor. I think the availability of material in Vermont especially is one of the factors, because what I found in looking at the Vermont collection is that almost all of them, their posts are made of white marble instead of granite. The Maine collection is all granite. In Vermont, they used both white marble slabs and white marble posts. That's the same in the Connecticut, on the Massachusetts western part of Mass, which is Connecticut River Valley. The quarries of, if you know Vermont, and I'm sure you do from living there, their marble quarries in Vermont were pushing out stone like crazy in the 1800s, and they used the stone that was available. So that's why we see a difference in the makeup of the post and slab in the Vermont collection than we do in Maine.
The difference between the Vermont and Maine, I lost my thought. The quality of the stone, would that be a factor of the fact that granite is not doing as well as the marble maybe?
Well, the slabs themselves are all marble and slate. It's the posts that are the granite. And marble is basically, that was the source. Marble in Maine was primarily imported from Connecticut River Valley or from Europe. So most of the marble that you see on grave markers in our cemeteries in Maine came from somewhere else. Black marble was harvested here in Thomason's area, and there's a lot of beautiful black marble that's in gravestones around. But for the most part, the white marble was really primarily from somewhere else. And so the slabs themselves that came from Connecticut River Valley or Europe are, the ones that are in Vermont and Western Mass are the same source. Yeah, so.
All right, and just to highlight another comment here, kind of going back to what Craig was saying, Marge says that the First Universalist church here in town has organizing records, and that Hill's story, of course, connects to their founding because the Hills were part of creating the Universalist chapel. So just to kind of point that out too.
Katie, did the Village Improvement Society have a role in funding the costs of restoring the billboard in the Hillside Cemetery?
I do not recall. I don't know if Linda's, yeah, there's Linda. Maybe she can kind of weigh in on their role in it.
No, the village, no. The town of Yarmouth actually has a maintenance fund with some preservation money in it, not a lot. And we were able to use that. Steve Johnson, after I showed him the stone and everything, he was quite interested in it. So he was actually paid for by the town of Yarmouth, because of course the cemetery is owned and maintained by the town of Yarmouth.
Right. Okay, thank you.
With help, of course, from Craig and Ron and Tamara.
I particularly like the picture of Julie with the open trunk of records there, because she's down on her knees. If there's anything that characterizes Julie's getting into a problem, it's being down and really digging into it. She's so wonderful.
Well, I remember that day, and they were hesitant to even let us go up in the attic. And they said, there's this terrible chest. I don't know if you want to go into it. And we, of course, Katie and I are like, oh yeah, sure, we'll do it. We'll do it. And I was weeding through Bible studies, right, Katie? What else was in that chest was basically a lot of Bible studies. And I kept saying, I don't think that the Yarmouth Historical Society really cares about Daniel and the lion. But we did find some real treasures also. Yeah, it's fun. It was fun.
Are there any plans to transcribe the notes or the letters, the correspondence, and to see what's in that? Or does that await? I mean, that could be, I guess, a project that an intern might do, or maybe the family is interested in doing it. Where does that stand?
Well, I did a few. That initial kind of surge of discovery prompted me to do several that I sent off to Craig. So he's got access to those, and those can be made available to researchers too. But there are a lot of letters. So yeah, that's a big project for a future intern or genealogist or someone interested in this field.
Yeah.
If I may, I just say, Bill, that part of the real treasure there are several letters by women, which are, it's really hard. It's been hard sledding in our family to know much about the women of these families, but to actually have their handwriting, their own feelings, their own communications on these important matters is really, I think, especially nice and a helpful thing.
Yeah.
I just want,
Oh,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
yeah, Bill, I was just going to explain to everybody, I'm sorry, I didn't say this, but Greg matched the money, or the town matched Greg's donation, and so it was split between those two people. So we have to thank Greg. I'm very sorry I didn't say it that way, but we were able to match his pledge of money to help this out. And I just think it was a wonderful thing, so.
I just wanted to, the thing that strikes me is how different it is now than when Eva Mae Cole showed up to do her research. It's so sad that she made it all the way to the cemetery and didn't know to just walk a few more steps in to get all the rest of the family, because all of those others, there's like 6 or 7 or 8 stones for the family further in. And I think what maybe confused her was the fact that the billboard right up front had a couple of slate markers right next to it for the family. She probably saw that and thought, well, this is where they are, and didn't realize walking further in, she would have seen everything. And of course, today, we all have the advantage of doing our research before we show up, and we've got findagrave.com. We've got all kinds of other records available to us to let us know what's available to us. And, you know, you can go search for something and have a good idea that it's there. So I just feel bad for her, you know, that she got so close and missed out on what she was looking for.
Guilty on all counts.
And missing the house, and maybe an opportunity to see inside it, but that would have been a treat. That's really an extraordinary program. I love it, the way all the pieces come together.
It really was just a perfect combination of Craig's research, the stone restoration, the letters in the wrong attic coming to me at the right time. You know, I guess there's a lesson in Eva May Cole's story is take a few more steps, get to the bottom of that trunk. You know, we save everything. I think Craig's right there. And like, you just have to keep looking sometimes for the treasures.
Would the town in Oklahoma, Cameron, Cameron, or Camden, Camden, or both?
It's actually Camden, Arkansas. That first word we had, they had spelled it Cameron because they'd never heard of it before. So they were trying to remember, but the place is actually Camden, Arkansas. And Teresa Harris, who's helped me a lot in Camden. She may have been on or may still be on this call today, but yeah, Camden, Arkansas. And it's on the Ouachita River.
Okay.
Kind of southeast Arkansas.
Okay.
These guys all left Maine to get some of that land that the Louisiana Purchase was just opening up. And so they all became merchants there, among other things. Ron mentioned a little more about what all they got into, but everyone in the family died once they left Maine and got to Arkansas, except one. A couple of them lasted a little longer than the others, but all of my bunch just lasted a few years.
Was consumption a common illness or more common in Camden than it would have been in other, say, in Maine at the time? You have any idea?
I
had wondered that too.
Yeah, no, consumption was huge in Maine. I mean, it was basically the largest cause of death many of the years. If you look at the tables of mortality that are available, it was prevalent. Yeah, it was the causes of death in the 1800s was primarily almost all bacterial disease that we have, you know, today antibiotics for. Dysentery, typhus, consumption, all this stuff that took people down. You know, much of it is today, you don't see it because of, you know, the availability of you know, medicine and science. Yeah.
And Craig's done some work on consumption
Bill,
in Maine specifically.
Yeah, which is I mean, before they realized that it was infectious, it was really deadly. I think it killed 1 in 7 adults around by the time of 1850. But it was far less prevalent in Arkansas during that time. That was newly settled. They were young people. When they started out, they were healthy. Now, some of them, I think, died from consumption, but accidents took a lot more people. Abby Burnett, who's been on this call, she knows a lot about these kinds of things, but it was actually more people in New England dying from consumption than were in the South in those days.
All right. Any
Wasn't
more-
the consumption mainly in New England probably had a lot to do with the type of weather we have as opposed to the people who lived in the Midwest and out in the West. I understand that there are a lot of people who relocated because of the disease, hoping to get better.
I've heard that too, yeah. I mean, down south, yellow fever. I found a lot of records for people. There were so many young men on the trade ships in Portland's thriving maritime economy. They would come home with yellow fever and die here of yellow fever, and that was not something that you would have found necessarily without them bringing it back from their trips to the Caribbean. It's a mosquito-borne illness. And so, yeah, interesting to see what kind of trends there were.
Another question here from Andy, who asks, Craig, how did you discover the consumption connection to the hills?
Okay, well, the Genealogy Bank website was actually the one that finally opened it up. Newspapers.com was helpful, but the Genealogy Bank, Ron had actually put me onto them, had access to old newspapers from this part of Maine that were just kind of coming online. So if I haven't said it strongly enough, I just want to say archivists are the ones that are saving the day in terms of these family stories, because we didn't have any way to access these newspapers. But I do have a newspaper account for each one of those young people, the tribute that was written about them. I had been curious whether the family was going to be shunned because they had so many people die of consumption, where people were kind of thinking they were cursed or bad luck or something like that. But it turns out that wasn't the case. All the tributes that are given are very lovely and sad about all of that. But yeah, it was newspapers that are now digitized that are available online that give us a chance to do that.
Mm.
All right. Any more lingering questions? All right, well, I think we're good. Thank you so much to Craig and Ron for this great talk. It was really fun to see this kind of pulled together. And thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Right, right.
Bye.